So thank you for joining for the 2025 Marine Conservation and Climate Change Communications Week. My name is Yande Sal Mohammed. I'm the director of the Gambia Marine and Environmental Conservation Initiative. I am the founder of #MarineCommsweek, as well as a strategic communication designer for marine conservation projects and climate change action projects. And today I'm very excited to introduce my colleague from Global Diplomacy Lab. We've been connected for years, and I'm really excited to hear Aghavni speak today to share a little bit more about strategic communications for advancing international climate policies. So I want to share a little bit about Aghavni's background with you today. Aghavni is an esteemed international communications expert with over 18 years of experience in strategic communications and media relations, and she brings a wealth of experience to this workshop that she designed for us specifically for this event, talking about, as I mentioned earlier, strategic communications for advancing international climate policies with a bit of a focus on marine conservation. Aghavni holds advanced degrees in journalism, public administration, and political geography, alongside an ongoing PhD research on networks and communication in public policy. She's led impactful communication strategies for international organizations and regional projects. Her extensive work across Armenia, Eastern Partnership countries, and beyond includes designing inclusive stakeholder engagement plans and leveraging innovative tools to enhance climate policy advocacy and marine conservation efforts. Aghavni is fluent in Armenian, English, and Russian and is committed to empowering future leaders with cutting-edge communication techniques to drive sustainable global change during this Zoom-based session scheduled today on November. So for those of you that are here, thank you so much for coming and attending. And for those of you that are tuning in to our recording, thank you for going back and watching the session. And I hope you enjoy it. And without any further ado, I would like to welcome Aghavni.
Thank you very much, Yanda. I'm really glad and feeling honored to be first time ever to be part of this Marine Communications Week. So let's go and right away to dig into the strategic communications while we try to communicate on climate policies, which are always complicated, let's say, documents. So how I felt about this session, it's overall how I saw that probably we would really need to understand the frameworks and challenges, to understand how the strategies should be designed and how the execution should be implemented. So what could be the topics that we can derive from the climate policy papers? On another side, probably we can also talk a bit about the overall communication arsenal. Let's say altogether tools, means, tactics, general theories that can be applied in this case. So, and not to really stay on this for a dip, as I am already presented, so no need for this part. Now, as I said already, the global communication, climate communication challenges, this is something that can be, in my understanding, divided into several chapters or areas, let's say. One is the complexity of all kind of papers related to climate, when the language is very technical, when the timelines and all the charts and everything seems really not an easy task for a simple reader, or let's say for an ordinary reader to understand, and misinformation, or let's say a lot of different approaches, different theories that we come across while talking about climate are also there, and sometimes you really need to leave everything aside and try to debunk or work against all these misinformation flows. And of course, the behavioral gap, when knowledge and action are not connected in reality. This is said, I mean that Mostly, if you ask people, they might be aware of climate change issues and other stuff, but their behavior, their awareness is not automatically translated into behavioral change. In a lot of cases, like people know about climate change, but they continue high carbon lifestyles, and recently all this plastic related also to marine situation is something that we all need to consider. The strategic communications framework. This is something I would really try, I would really love my colleagues and whoever is interested in the topic to bear in mind that better to approach with this scope SCOPE model when we can divide the overall process starting from stakeholder analysis, then context and research that provide a ground for messaging, bring for us the overall data, the everything that is special to any local geography or any local country or any local context. And then the objectives and KPIs. Of course, this is something that is always great to have, but believe me, from my experience, especially with the EU for Climate project, that was all over about climate policy papers that had to, that were dealt and adopted, developed, implemented by Eastern Partnership countries, namely Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus back then. So all those cases were really tough while it came to the objectives and KPIs. Why I am saying so? Because a paper like a climate policy paper that is developed goes to the government, gets adopted, becomes part of the legislation, but there is nothing, no single word about a specific impact that the climate policy paper can have on my life, on your life, on people's life. That's making the communicating process very complicated and difficult. Whatever, I do believe that for the objectives, we can go with the SMART objectives, being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, because in any work, hard it is or not, difficult it is or not, it's better always to really keep your work in frames. So for KPIs categories, of course, output metrics is good, outcome metrics is good, and impact is the most important part that we all, let's say, fight for, work for, go for, and aim for. So impact is something that every single communication is for. So the next would come planning and execution. This is overall how we translate strategy into action. The thing is that we can have really great strategies written, developed, adopted, or let's say approved, whatever. But when it comes to the real life, the planning and execution is the key, because all great ideas may die in papers and do not become alive. That's what, for planning and execution, I see several key components, like the message development. All communication people struggle with this. When you need to come up with core messaging, you need to be audience specific, you need to support your message with facts, with visuals, and always to be prepared for any objections, especially in relation to climate change. As I said, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation in this regard, so better always to be prepared for that as well. Then another key component that I would really recommend to paying attention while working to communicate the climate policies, it would be the channel selection. why I put it like a second priority given criteria in this regard, because what we see sometimes really great messages do not reach the right audience because they are channeled through platforms or let's say tools that are not really the best to reach a specific audience or a segment of the audience. So then we come to the content creation. That's the routine and everyday life of communication people. Whatever we do, it's in general content creation. But I would really like to emphasize that even though recent days and let's say academically in postmodern society, visuals are the guts, but still, I do believe that text accompanied with a good visual, a good text accompanied with a visual is something that would be the most impactful rather than really having fancy visuals and images that do not really uh, catch the eye, even though catching the eye, but they can't really keep the audience interested. So then the resource allocation, let's say, of course, every communication action needs really some resource. With an extensive work for development projects, I would say that these resources, meaning also financial resources, proper time resources, are given less and less importance, putting all the burden of communicating on a communication person if you are single, or on the communication team if you are lucky enough to have at least 2-3 colleagues in your work. But this shouldn't be the case because the world is getting more and more monetized. A lot of things are now commercial, and getting into your plate or into your boat other people that are interested in the same topic becomes harder and harder. And of course, the final would be the implementation of all the stuff. I see like some in the chat, some information. Is that relevant for my? Oh, it's just okay. So then we go. So the another part that I'll go through quickly is the evaluation and monitoring. Of course, every single work that is done, it's better to monitor and evaluate so that later on you can really bring at least the lessons learned that are supported with data, that are supported with research and analysis. So not really going deeper in these topics. Let's move to the climate policy context. I have brought specific context from my experience, not to really elaborate academically, but having all derived from the experience I went through. Of course, at the first place, that's the Paris Agreement, where all different countries come and try to bring their commitment to this Paris Agreement. EU Green Deal came a bit later, and it's something that is really, really relevant, becoming relevant to everyone. But before, sorry for jumping to the EU Green. So the Paris Agreement, why it's very essential and why it's very difficult to communicate, because with all these NDCs, INDCs, MRVs, LEDs, and other stuff, even COP, like nowadays you can be confused because we have like two types of COP. So one gets to the climate, the other goes to the biodiversity, whatever, but still like a lot of confusion, a lot of terms, a lot of very, very technical language that one of my project managers would always emphasize that communication people are the ones that do translation from English into English still, but making it for understandable for human beings. So those are documents that are very, very technical. Even the nationally determined contributions, which is the NDC very popularly known, but still for this, you need to put a lot of effort to explain to people what is that. And regarding the communication opportunities, what I have done and what worked for me always, never ever I had a failure with this in this regard, that I was always trying to work with experts and to understand, for example, an NDC data saying like, I don't know, reducing emissions by this year, by this percentage, what does it mean for me? Personally, as a person, how I may feel it, where I can see it, or how I can touch it. So that was really a good trick to work with experts and try to get an information that can help me to communicate about all these policy papers that are really difficult to understand. But still, for example, the MRV, the monitoring and other stuff, all these things, I mean, there are cases that the policy papers are really very complicated, very technical, and very expert level. They may generate only expert level interest. Those are, let's say, those are not communicable for people in general. So sometimes it happens, but whatever. The EU Green Deal is another package of a lot of policies that come about, carbon neutrality, green economy, just transition, and those are, until now, for most of the countries that we come from, sounds like something very, very far in the future. For example, if I bring the example of Armenia, then the green economy is something everyone wants, but to build this, and of course later on to communicate about that, it's very hard, because in most of the cases, all this carbon neutrality, green economy, just transition, those are costly goals, costly aims. So communicate about something that may, let's say, harm people's wealth or really tough conditions that in many countries people live in. So it really makes the communicating process complicated and difficult, because, you know, I mean, in many countries for people, the daily bread, so-called, is the top priority. And to communicate about just transition or green economy to those people is a challenging work, let's say. And the COP summit, as I say, like from year to year, the COP summits happen. A lot of events take place. Nowadays, the format is in a way that a lot of side events are also organized. But whenever you take and try to really understand the context, like what was really agreed on, what the co-participants were not lucky enough to finalize as an agreement, then you can understand that there is another gap of communication work. But unfortunately, within separate projects, or let's say single projects, you can't really communicate well about COP. Communication channel also here is can be explained that the annual circle creates fatigue about like just another climate meeting. I mean, it's not really something that you need to be focused on. Another challenge is that a lot of negotiations happen. And when those negotiations are communicated, we are facing the difficulty of explaining, for example, advancing NDC to NDC 2 or to NDC 3, and the figures are changing slightly, which for people not really matter in the sense that you don't see the difference of reducing emissions by 3.5 or 3.1%. But then comes the challenge that we really need to explain people how this 0.4% may make a difference in our life. So another challenge also can be that as lately we can see, COP is not always reaching the COP summits are not always reaching the ambitions. So like when I started my work with you for climate, I remember it was like 2020, 5 years ago exactly, but 5 years ago, everyone was talking about 2030. That is something, that's a frame, that's a limit, that's the end of all efforts for changing, because we need to change the gradual increase of temperature, average temperature in our countries. But now many people, many countries, including well-developed countries, they all talk about that 2030 is not reachable. So whatever ambitions were in the summits, now we see that countries either were lacking more efforts or lacking the will, whatever, that's another issue to analyze. But we have a situation that we see a clear, let's not name it a failure, but the challenge becomes bigger, let's say. Bigger with every year that we approach 2030. And we see that this boundary may be wider, let's say, maybe pushed further to 2035 or 2040, because the goals were very, very ambitious, not that realistic, let's say. And in regard marine conservation and marine climate issues, I am not a big expert of this, but so far in my experience, I could see that all this mitigation and adaptation work, the blue carbon, sustainable fishery, and all other questions that are linked to marine are again in a challenging situation regarding communication, because with, let's say, if I simplify the idea behind this thought and bring the example of oceans, even recently, like we see a lot of topics about this microplastic issue in oceans, but because it's not felt by people, it's not touchable, let's say, people don't see even that. Of course, for communication, we need a different data. For example, how like this microplastic appears in the milk, in dairy, every product we use, or any other field. So there are, of course, ways, but still we see the challenging situation. So from my experience, as I said, like working for you for climate project and communicating mainly about policy papers, we had all the paperwork done regarding the data collection, the strategy development, the country-specific communication plans. We had all, and at the beginning for a year and a half, almost for 2 years, all the KPIs seemed to be very, very difficult to reach, just because all the technical work was done by experts. No publicizing tools were used. And once we built out the website, the communication work started really flowing slowly, even though like you have the climate policy papers. In this project, we had them in 6 languages of each country we were working in. And for each country, we had a specific topic that was given priority, and some other topics that were like put as a sub priority. So to communicate it from the regional perspective was another challenge. So the policy papers have this dual quality, or let's say characters, in a way that it's of course at country level, because every policy paper becomes part of a country specific legislation. But on the other side, all the policy papers are forming a picture above a single country, which may be regional, maybe continental, or maybe, I don't know, for the world matter. So, of course, multi-stakeholder engagement was another challenge for communication work, but here is like, this is a challenge that you don't face permanently, but once all the communication work is set, you can push the things forward. As I said, the sectoral focus. In some of our countries, like we had Eastern Partnership, 6 countries. In some countries, for example, energy and transport were the main emitters, like the main sources for emissions, while in other countries we had agriculture or some other sector. So again, sector-wise communicating and trying to do it at the regional level was a challenge, but at country levels, at least when you have a specific sector that you can focus on or bring the examples from or derive the examples from the sector, helps a lot. We have done many campaigns, so I'm not gonna really stop there, but I can share later on more detailed the presentation, so whoever is interested. Plus, the EU for Climate.eu website is still alive, even though the project ended. So if someone is interested more in Eastern Partnership countries, climate change policies and climate-related situation, you can check simply, the website is there. So the audience, I believe that mostly people linked to communication or working in communication or doing communications are the main audience for us. So I do believe that this is the most interesting part for communication people when we start audience segmentation, trying to understand who is the persona, let's say, for us, like how we should work with them, what are the main characteristics for the persona. But in general, when we talk about climate change policy papers, then the policy makers are the first group that we need to bear in mind, even though the communication work is not mainly for them, but for public, but still the policy makers are the ones, so we need to understand their profile, their interests, motivations, the information needs, whatever they might need, and the key messaging, again, here can be something that we need to consider. Then the private sector is another segment of audience we need to really work closely. And from years, I would say, like personal observation drawn from my experience would be that private sector is the one that for climate change, we need to work hand on hand. We need to work together, because states alone with their policy papers can't really do a lot. But the private sector is the one that really needs to enhance their social responsibility, corporate responsibility, and think and act and operate more climate friendly, environment friendly. That's why I do believe that this segment of audience is the one we really need to be close and to work closely. Civil society in climate change context is another segment of audience that I do believe needs to be prioritized, because we have a lot of environmental advocacy groups, community-based organizations, youth-driven organizations, movements, motions, human rights organizations, value-driven, high-motivated, resource-constrained organizations that can have the interest and motivation in climate justice, for example, in environmental protection, in transparency, accountability that can be based on environment-friendly actions and works done. Public participation in decision-making also related to environment and climate change and other topics as well. So the civil society organizations, of course, have their needs of information that can be detailed policy analysis, that can be data on emissions, that can be networking, and also mainly, as I see, social CSOs can prefer to get the information from social media. They have their own networks, coalitions, and of course, media as like the independent media and investigative journalists. Here, a good example for really open work, transparent and accountable work in communicating climate change could be done with investigative journalism organizations or freelance investigative journalists, because they also do a huge work to bring a lot of stuff to the attention of public. And the general public, I don't like naming a segment in general of audience, general public, but sometimes all other small groups, like, for example, linked to health, to livelihood, local impact of different aspects or different economy sectors or different areas, whatever, those are put together under the general public, even though the general public as a segment is not really the best wording to use. And here also a bit of marine sector stakeholders, then can be fishing communities, coastal tourism operators, for example, ocean scientists, and all them can be driven with the livelihood security issues, food security issues, or it can be cultural identity part, or it can be an economic development way doing the things. And of course, understanding their information needs is something that can be a basis for the communication work. Then, of course, once, let's say, we are done with segmenting our audience, as I tried to do briefly for you, then crafting effective messaging is something that we are always struggling with. I should emphasize here all the local contexts, all the local understanding, all the local specifics, that sometimes, for example, if you are an international communication expert, you might not be aware of. You can, of course, research, you can, of course, do your homework, be prepared for a lot of stuff, but sometimes local communication expert, local communication people are the best ones for crafting messages. And here, of course, as we can go to the science and ask for support, we need to think about the impact. And of course, we need to come up with a good, really good wording so that the message really hits the points we want, hits the segment of the audience we want. And then, of course, in a general work, like tailoring all this messaging according to the audience, a specific audience, is the way we work, let's say, or do the things. I would really love to bring here some examples, in a sense that you can always do craft a good message, for example, in English, and then while you translate into other languages, you may really see that it's not working, it becomes blurred, it's kind of becoming doom instead of like really messaging whatever we want. So another point with messaging that always helped me in my experience are all kind of testing opportunities. if you are not fancy enough in your work and do not have resources for focus groups, for A/B testing or surveys, for consulting the partners, go to your grandparents, go to your children, because they are also a great testing, let's say, platform, testing mechanism or testing channel for any message. If you can explain or the message you crafted is understandable or hits the emotions or brings any sense for your grandparents or for your children, then you are good, you can continue. Communication work is always, let's say, in many cases, unfortunately, we do a lot of ad hoc basis work. Like the crisis comes, the problem comes, the challenge comes, and we start working. We try our best to be very quick, to provide a quick reaction, whatever. But the best, of course, would be really to come up with the campaign, to design and to implement it properly, I'm sorry, rather than really to do the work of ad hoc basis in here or there that won't really generate a global impact. So for the campaign, of course, needs assessment is something that you can do even with very, very few resources, in a sense that it's always good to ask your audience, like, what is their information needs, and assess them to get like what is the correct level of awareness, whether you have aware people, whether they support the policy, for example, how they see the barriers to a greater support, like what are the assets, what channels, communication channels are preferred. And of course, if we have resources, that's great, but if not, then really better to think of. Then we need to really understand the goal, the main idea that we really want to communicate. And here comes a good, nice, and academically well developed, and as a tool, well digested way, which is the theory of change. Like, we come with inputs, then we do the activity, then we generate the outputs, outcomes, and of course, we see the impact. Nowadays, another very, very popular idea is the behavioral change communications, when we really aim for changing the behavior, because, I mean, people of my age may easily say, like, back 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, the whole communication was mostly about awareness raising. Like, every single organization would require communication people to do more awareness raising, to raise awareness, to make people aware, to spread the information. But now we see that making people aware is not really the best goal to work for. So better to work in a way that awareness raising can contribute to the behavioral change. So nowadays, communication also is aiming for behavioral change. Sorry. Another point here, of course, comes to the channels. Fortunately or unfortunately, but we need to bear in mind that nowadays people do not care much about facts, but people care more about emotions. People care about what they feel about a certain thing. So if we want really to be successful, facts are always needed and should be basis for any communication, but we need really to understand how people emotionally may feel while being part of our campaign. That's why it's always better to really focus the campaign in a way that it raises emotions. It pushes people to leave aside indifference and really be attached touched by the topic. I would really love to bring the example that we have done a campaign within the EU for climate, but also with the several in several other countries with UNDP climate-linked and environment-linked projects that I worked for. We had a very, very nice, very touchy, very emotional approach and campaign that was titled, "There is no Planet B." This is something that, to my knowledge, was really the best communicated, that people were really touched. It's always great to say that with the climate change nowadays challenged and threats and environmental issues, the weather worsening and other stuff, we don't have any other option. It's not like we have another planet that we can do whatever we want here and then move to the other side. So here is that we have no choice but behave climate-wise and environment-friendly. So that was a campaign that we were considering really to be very successful. Another one that is linked also to marine topic was the ocean is the life. So won't we or not, but water is something that we can't do without. And if we are not caring, we are not treating the water properly, then we will end up somewhere with no life possibility on our planet. So there are a lot of other examples as well that can be brought, but let's move on. The campaign significant part that I would really like to draw your attention is also the timing, or let's say overall the timeline. Why I say so? Because however, if you approach communication academically even, which I do now in my PhD thesis, still I believe that luck is something that communication people need in their work, somewhere on top or as a ground for our work. And that's what is strongly linked to the timeline. Why I say so? Because you can really design a great strategy, a campaign, do everything, do the whole homework you need to do, like in the sense of segmentation of the audience, defining the goal, the objectives, coming up with great messages, whatever. But timing is something that you really need to take into account the other developments in your country or the region, the other aspects that people might be much more concerned at a certain point. And I won't really go far for an example. I can bring my own country's, Armenia's example. When we were just starting the EU for Climate, I joined EU for Climate, and EU for Climate was there for around 2 years and doing really significant work. A war happened in South Caucasus, where Armenia and Azerbaijan were involved, and a lot of plans, climate-wise, very nice one, a lot of draft policies, LEDs, NDCs, and other stuff were really frozen or put aside for more than a year. So the work that was done was ready, and there was only a small push needed for making those policies as a state document that states would feel obliged to follow. We had to frozen all these things and wait for a proper moment. So time is really something, and timeline is really something that we need to be aware of. A lot of other things that at a first glance might not really seem to be influential on our work as communication specialist work, but you never know. In many cases, other events, other activities, or even other policies that at the first glance are not strongly linked to climate work, they might really influence strongly. And of course, resource allocation, that is something that we need to be aware of. The overall monitoring and evaluation we have talked about. Let's talk a bit, because I see like time-wise I'm not gonna really fit, and I'm really sorry for the voice and not really feeling good, not being very energized. But the crisis communication is also something that really deserves a word to put in this presentation, in a sense that crisis happens everywhere. Crisis comes with a lot of issues, and crisis is something that we face also in communication work, especially with the climate context. So it's always great to be prepared. You need to really map the risk and possible crises, then really be prepared in a sense of messaging or statements that you can release once the crisis happens. And it's always, of course, great to be preventing the crisis in communications rather than reacting to the crisis. But as said, I mean, we are not cats. We can't really do a prediction of everything. We can, of course, forecast. We can, of course, try to analyze and see what are the tendencies, what are the trends, what are the major dimensions of communication developments, but still we can't really predict everything. So we need to have both scenarios for preventing, but also for reacting properly. Of course, response needs to be always fast, needs to be empathetic, needs to be very honest, because it's a crisis situation. We don't have a way and a place for maneuvers, for maneuvering. And here the word fast really means a lot, which is not the case, unfortunately, with international organizations. Many international organizations are very slow, in a sense that you undergo a lot of approval processes, and at the end, like ending up response finalized in 2 weeks, which is no more relevant to the situation. So really acting fast. And that's why I say that being prepared is good, because a lot of things can be agreed ahead of everything happening, rather than waiting for the situation emerge and then you start reacting. Of course, managing properly is something we all need to do, and recovery point, that at least to get to the point that you were before the crisis in your communications, is something we need to be working hard. If I may, I would really love to bring here some don'ts, what better not to do in this kind of situation. That if crisis in your communications happens, it's better not to comment, really to act in a sense that bringing your own content, your own messaging. Do not speculate, do not make unprepared conclusions. The worst thing that communicators sometimes also do is when we start blaming others without evidence, without proper factual ground. Better not to really, in crisis especially, not to look for whom to blame, but really work towards solutions, towards mitigating or normalizing the communication, rather than really blaming others. There is no need for really fueling anything that you see that may take everyone's attention to a wrong direction. And of course, if you, especially in crisis situation, do a different messaging to different audiences, then it's not really the best way. Better to act in a generalized, in a overall impactful way, rather than trying to communicate messages, different messages to different audiences. And recovery phase is very, very important, but here we really need to be driven to with the aim of normalizing the situation, like bringing everything to its normal way to do. The countering climate disinformation, that's another thing we are becoming challenged more and more in a sense that at the highest possible level, at the level of different countries, presidents and prime ministers, we can hear challenging statements about climate change, whether like the whole climate change is a false understanding, whatever, and bringing it to the very detailed point. What I would like for all of us to bear in mind is that there are several tactics that can be used while countering disinformation also in climate change field, which is of course like the simple would be denial. Then it's picking a data that is not the whole truth, let's say, or bringing the false experts or conspiracy all over, like in our life. Unfortunately, now we have a lot of kind of things, conspiracy explained, let's say, or manipulated through conspiracy. So key takeaways from here would be really like focusing on communicating simple and emotional, but science-based, because climate change still remains very, let's say, science-burdened or science enriched sphere. Another point that the segmenting audiences and tailoring messages helps a lot. Integrating climate and marine narratives in other narratives and our other agendas, also something that can be helpful, in a sense that we don't emphasize climate change separately, but it's part of other points and other issues. Evaluating continuously and trying to adapt to the new realities, new challenges, or changing factors. Being prepared always for crises, trying to debunk misinformation and disinformation, and always being inspired with our actions and hoping and sharing the responsibility rather than going, let's say, a bit far from all of this, like the responsibility sharing and responsible acting. So I would really like to share also some digital tools and innovations in the climate change, because nowadays with artificial intelligence, with a lot of platforms appearing every day as new that promise to support us in our work, climate change is also something that requires being very conscious while using different tools, digital tools and innovations. Of course, we go digital. Today, everything is digital, like all the social platforms digital, all the messengers digital, all the work we do digital, a lot of things we can, we create and we come up still are digital. And here we have a kind of a dilemma in regard to climate change in general. And it's not only about the communication, because, for example, using a lot of AI tools means, first of all, consuming very, very, very much energy, making like water to be used intensively, extensively for all the same AI tools and servers and everything to be cooled down. And this is also a way for us to think whether these digital tools that can be used, and it's mainly because of the climate change topic as well. And for example, like every single attachment we do, it's an energy consumption. Energy consumption, it's the energy field emissions. Energy field emissions is the climate change issue. So whether we see all this channel while we use digital tools and all innovative things, or we try really to be very, very consumer wise, let's say, bearing in mind that every single AI-based activity is very high energy consuming. Second, so the strategic partnership and collaboration. Communication nowadays is something that we really need to do through the partnerships. Because as I said, like with years, especially in development projects, in development work, communication people are left with no sources, meaning financial, meaning the staff, and meaning the timing. Sometimes you are alone on your own. You are, in a good case, you would have like a small budget dedicated for your work. And the partnerships are something that can be really helpful for increasing the impact making it much more bigger. Because as said, like if you're lacking financial resources, then you can't really do a lot on your own, because even on the social media, a lot is paid, even with the AI using, even with other digital and innovative platforms using, everything is paid. So you can do some stuff free of charge, but still then it's time consuming, very, very time consuming for you. So building partnership is strategic, and being collaborative is also another behavior, let's say, model that communication people can use. Being partners with governments, being partners with media, being partners with private sector. And as I said, private sector can gain a momentum because of this all corporate and social responsibility nowadays, like this all social corporate responsibility are given more space for the private. Of course, those are given more space also for the big companies, but for the small, we can also go with their social and corporate responsibility and engage as partners, private sector as well. And social society is another segment, let's say, or part of the society in general that we really can rely on. Here, we need to bear in mind that we need to have shared goals with whomever we are partnering. We need to be transparent in our communication, clearly and openly explaining what are our goals and what is the aim of the partnership we want to build with them. And of course, better to always ensure joint visibility and co-branding. It's another issue that is given more and more, let's say, space in nowadays communication, because in many cases, even donors fight for the visibility, spacing for, or sometimes a joint project is used by one of the sides or one of the partners without ensuring the other partner's visibility and branding properly placed. Capacity building, and also making efforts for leadership or the flagship point is another thing that I would really like to draw your attention to, because all the workshop opportunities, different communities like me and Yande coming from Bosch community, Bosch Alumni Network community, and also linked through the Global Diplomacy Lab as well. Like all those communities as networks of practice, or can be only like shared goals or shared values, are another way that we really need to build our capacity on. Peer learning is another thing, and I believe this is a good, a vivid example. All this communication week organized that we can really share our experience, we can learn from each other, and it could be like contributing to the peer learning. There are many, many toolkits that I can also share later with whoever would be interested. And why all this matters? I would say, of course, because learning is nowadays lifelong. And another point that we as climate change and marine conservation communicators, we need to stay competitive. Those are not really very, very popular fields to cover as communication people. But if we want to stay competitive in a sense that do our work at the highest possible way and bring bigger impact, then we really need to think of our own capacity building. So that's why all these trainings, workshops, communities, networks, learning opportunities, and good, simple constructed toolkits are a good way for us to operate better and bring bigger impact. Ethical climate communication is another point I draw here attention, but let's jump to the future trends. Of course, AI would be integrated, but here also we need to bear in mind that AI is not a good distinguisher of false and true information. So whenever we use AI, especially for climate change, excuse me, seemingly I was disconnected. Let me get to my, a second, to my future trends. Okay. Do you see it in the presentation now?
Yep, we can see it.
Great, but I can't move it. Just a second. And I'm close to the end, so
Okay, no problem. We have a couple
bit,
questions in the chat,
a
so
bit more patient, and let me find the slide to make it. Okay. So the among the future trends, also I would really like to emphasize the climate influences already becomes like a micro advocacy, in a sense that unfortunately many people now can feel the impact of the climate change, and of course integrated narratives in a sense that better not to stand alone, but be in partnership, in collaboration, in cooperation with other topics and areas. So I believe we can skip the exercise because I have already exhausted most of the time. So here are some toolkits, resources, and further reading literature. And for conclusion, so while communicating policy, we need to think of that very policy impact. That's why we need the strategic communication. We always need to tailor, simplify as possible, and humanize or translate into the human being languages the climate narratives. We need to integrate ocean climate dimensions and collaborate, evaluate, and adapt continuously. It's a non-stop work. So I'll stop here and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Aghavni, for this very intensive and amazing presentation. It was extremely detailed. We will plan on sending these presentations, as I mentioned in the beginning, out to people in case you want this as a resource. And of course, all of the sessions of this week will be recorded and available on our YouTube to watch back in case you missed anything and you came in late, or if you just want to use it to watch again as a resource. We have two questions, one from Maya and another from Po Kwan Liu. So if you're able to unmute your mic, Maya, and turn on your camera, you can feel free to ask the question. And if you are unable to, you can also just put in the chat that I can tell the question, and then I can do that as well. So maybe she's not available, so I will just go for
yes.
Okay, yes.
Maybe you read the question because she
Yes, I
has
will just read the question. Maya's question refers to Georgia's climate change strategy 2030 and the long-term low emission development strategy 2050, both developed with the UNDP's assistance. She's asking, how do you see these national strategies aligning with the broader EU for Climate regional framework as well, particularly in terms of implementation and monitoring progress through carbon neutrality?
Oh,
heavy question. If you can keep your response into 2
so
minutes.
many questions, so many
Max.
questions. How I see, first of all, if I may, to make a general remark, is that in many cases, UNDP does a great job regarding the climate change at first. Different donors from time to time support UNDP activities. Sometimes there is no funding for that, but UNDP keeps going with its climate promise. That's the general umbrella program of climate change under the UNDP. I should have mentioned that the EU for Climate was also implemented by UNDP, but of course funded by the European Union. So the thing is that to answer in short, all those policies at the beginning, like NDC, becomes part of the overall legislation. Then from the NDC, you get LEDS, for example, which is the low emissions development strategy, which means that all those climate promises in the NDCs needs to be transferred to the lower in every single sphere, legislation, every new activity or new project, everything should consider the climate. To bear in mind that every single, for example, sector of economy brings its part in the promises, whether we keep the promise under the Paris Agreement or we don't as a country. So that's one thing, that NDCs are great, but we need it to be incorporated in the overall legislations so that it works. And secondly, can I see the question from the Okay, influencing citizens' habits. Am I picking the Mayas? Yes, Maya.
It's yeah. How do you see the
Yeah.
national
Okay.
strategies aligning with the broader EU for climate regional framework
Okay.
as well, particularly
Hmm.
in terms of implementation and
Yeah.
monitoring progress?
That's another. Thank you, Yanda. That's another issue that we need to look to the countries' perspectives, whether they are pro EU, whether they go in that direction. So far, I'm not an expert in that, but so far as Georgia was making a very, very good advancement in EU towards the EU integration, but now there is a lot of things politically happening in the country. So I believe that all this EU approximation work is kind of a bit slowed down, but hopefully Georgia as well as Armenia would at some point really stand above everything and go for the approximation, because EU's legislation in that regard is really advanced. All the directives are think that we all need, we all better to let's say accept or understand or at least try to implement in our countries.
Thank you so much. And we'll try to also make sure all of the questions that you have that we send them in response with the slides as well, just in case you'd want to follow up a little bit more on that and also get in touch with Aghavni. We have we have kind of two questions. So if you can keep it short and sweet, and then we can follow up
Uh-huh.
with more information in the email. So
Mhm.
referring to the second slide about how to quantify science communication to policy. Is there some example of measurable KPIs in different policy stages and timelines? And then the second question is, what do you think would be the key elements if making a practical template for scientists to communicate science to policymakers? Yes. Two
Actually, we
heavy
are now
questions.
like, yeah, but we are now a bit like flowing to another communication sector, which is called science communication.
Yeah.
So climate change can be part of the science communication, but can also stand alone. Climate change communication, I mean. But communicating science, that's a different, let's say, uh, area, field of communication. Still, at least nowadays, you can see in a lot of cases that, for example, think tanks like different institutions, universities, academias, they really want science communicators. That's that's a bit different, let's say, because want we or not, the climate change is very scientific nowadays, but still it's not pure science in a sense of communicating science. So I would say like that key element would be really to think, as I said, how I can explain the things to my grandma or my children. Why I say so? Because even for the science, like when I do the homework with my son after the school, it's always challenging for me to communicate to my son the importance or of this and that discipline. But what I do, I always try really to explain how in our daily life maths or physics can play a role. And it's not like a significant thing is playing role, but the overall, the understanding, the meaning, the method, the way it's done, the way it's understood, whatever. So that's the way I do. I mean, as simple as possible. And as for the first part of the question, the KPIs, you mean for
Yeah, KPIs
policy
for
timeline?
policy stage and policy timelines. Yeah.
See, like a KPI that maybe can be somehow linked also to the second part of the question is, for example, under the EU for climate, we had also communication for experts. So that's a KPI for us to bring more experts into the topic so that they, if someone is covering, let's say, urban development, they would start considering climate change issues. If someone is working on I don't know, working on food security, again, marine conservation and other stuff can be brought very deeply to the topic. So for me, that's a KPI in a way that much more places that mention climate change as a challenge or climate change as a topic of high importance or climate change as something that we need to make people aware of. But there are also like very, very, let's say, communication-wise KPIs, which can be the reach, of course, which can be the viewers, which can be those that spend more time on reading your articles. That's our also like the standard package of KPIs for any communication campaign or a strategy or the plan. So that can be also applied in this case.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer, Aghavni. Hopefully that answered your question. And we also have one or two sessions that do focus on, one of them does specifically focus on science to policy to campaigning and advocacy. And there will be another one that looks at science to journalism and climate change journalism. So I highly recommend following up on the agenda to see if you can join in. Yeah, so thank you again, Aghavni, for your time. Maya, if you want to connect with Aghavni, you are both GDL members to follow up more on your question as well. And as I mentioned, we will try to get those answers to your questions down within the email that we send out in the slide. I would like to thank you again for joining us to open up as our speaker for
Thank you
day
too for the
one of
opportunity.
Marine Comms Week. It's really appreciated. And we hope that you all join us for the rest of the week, for the rest of the sessions. Tomorrow, we have an amazing speaker all the way from Taiwan, from Blue Trend Media, Joy, who's going to be coming in and sharing her work and her experience. So hopefully you can join us tomorrow, same time, same format, and see you all then. Thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
too. Bye.